Okay, our presenter today is Jim Davis. Jim is the County Extension Director for Sumter County, but based in Bushnell. He leads programs in natural resources and urban pest management. He's been with the Extension, I think, going on 20 years. Has a degree in environmental horticulture from UF and a master's in entomology for UF, so he is a double gator. He's currently president of our Professional Association for Extension Agents, so we're happy to have him in that service. And he's also an award-winning photographer and a passionate Florida native. And this photo here of the Sandhill Crane Colts is an award-winning photo, so we're very proud of Jim, national award. And I grabbed one of Jim's posters because Jim does a lot of innovative programming where he gets people really out into nature to experience it and so they can understand Florida and really see Florida through his eyes to truly care about the environment and therefore make changes in their landscaping and the way they use the land to really be a benefit to the land instead of a draw or a take on the land. So Jim, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to stop share and I'm inviting you to share and talk to us today about ethnobotany.
Sure, let's get it cranked up. I think we're all good to go. Looks pretty good on my end. Can you see it okay, Wendy? All right, wonderful. Using requests. I don't know what that is. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. So I'm very happy to share one of the presentations that I love doing. I originally titled this as Native Plants Found When Hiking and Other Ethnobotanical Uses. I've been doing guided hikes for over 15 years, in Sumter County and other counties as well. And it's getting to know these native plants and what their uses were, either by pioneers, Native Americans, medicinal. Some are true, some are not true. It really adds to the hiking experience whenever you go out into the woods. So I'm going to share some of these plants for you today. There's a ton of plants out there. I'm going to give you some resources at the end for y'all to check out because there's so many plants out there, both native and non-native with ethnobotanical uses. But we're going to cover native plants. Now, if you know me, I'm going to start with a palm tree because whenever I was the horticulturalist and master gardener coordinator in Sumter, my palms are still my specialty, so I love my palm trees. And so I have to talk about the cabbage palm or sable palmetto. So this was a designated state tree in 1953. In 1970, it replaced a coconut palm on the state seal. So you can see up here the older version of our state seal. You can see that coconut palm, and they switch it to our native cabbage palm later on. Now, the interesting thing is with the sables is that you have a sable palm tree and all these little brown things that are hanging down from the leaves. That's the old inflorescence or the flowers, which eventually turns into the fruit. And so that fruit is very valuable for wildlife, even whenever it flowers out. Excellent pollinator, excellent for wildlife. So about 10 to 25% of a raccoon's diet can be fruit from this palm tree. And if you're a native Floridian, you probably tried swamp cabbage sometime over your life. Um, so I've I've eaten it raw. Not my thing, but it's cooked over the fire with meat seasoning or eaten raw. So that's basically the heart of the palm is that swamp cabbage. Now it does kill the tree, so you have to understand that. So it should be taken from a small tree, but that wasn't an alternative food source that is still used to this day. The Seminoles and other Native Americans used the berries to treat for headaches and fever. Now, in some of these items that I'm going to be explaining to you as far as their medicinal and stuff like that, I don't know the exact science behind that as far as it works or not. Okay, so this is all anecdotal. So thatch that was used in the chickee houses. So this is one. I'm going to show you a real one in a second. So you can see this house on the left-hand side. This is probably those big timber that you have on the bottom. It's probably cypress, I would imagine. But you can see how this gentleman right here is woven this thatch, these leaves into this house. And so you can seal it really, really tight so it becomes waterproof. So that's the cheeky houses, okay, um, of those leaves. Now, Some people call the palms fronds. Botanically, that's inaccurate. They're really leaves, but it goes hand in hand. Now, the coolest part of this plant to me is the petioles were used to make bats. So it's the precursor to modern day lacrosse. This is the short name. Other tribes like Chickasaw tribes, Seminoles, all these Native Americans use this plant. They probably use some other plants, but this plant predominantly for the bat to make stickball. This is the short name of it. It's totally. It's quite long. But I think it was called Little War Game or something like that. But this was like over 400 years old. That's been all the southeastern tribes played this game to settle war disputes and just as a game. In fact, you can see it in the movies. Have you ever seen that classic movie, Last of the Mohicans with Daniel Day-Lewis? In the beginning part of that movie, when he goes out with his brother and plays, that's that game. And here you have on the bottom picture these black fruit, which are used for wildlife. As a wildlife photographer, it's great because you have robins, cedar waxwings, a whole bunch of different wildlife. This is, without a doubt, one of the best wildlife plants out there. Now, here's what a real life chickee house looks like. This is at Dade Battlefield in my home county of Bushnell. This is where they kicked off the Second Seminole War um, in, um, in in Florida. In fact, the up where y'all are, where you're from, Wendy, with Micanopy, Chief Micanopy was the one who fired the first shot. Okay, and so you can see this house right here. They woven these leaves. It's pretty quite impressive how they do this. And this is all cypress and just a really, really cool thing. And so this is what they used to make their houses and everything out of. So speaking of cypress, we had the taxodium. Yeah, bald cypress and pond cypress. Um, these were used by different tribes, the Calusa, the Miccosukee, the Seminole later on. Again, wood houses, ox bows used for toys, coffins, drums, but they also use them for canoes. So you can see this picture at the bottom, this gentleman right here with this, looks like it's maybe his son right there. This is a long, thin dugout canoe, and you can see that paddle, all that's made out of cypress. So that was the predominant transportation that you have in the Seminoles down in the Glades. Okay. And so the nice thing, the cool thing about those canoes, is that you can actually flip it over and sink it. It's not going to rot, so you can hide it. And there's still these canoes being found every so often. If you get a hurricane, some places that erode or some erosion, you still find these old dugout canoes. Okay. Modern day uses, furniture, shingles, beehives, fence posts. That's what we used them back in the day too, growing up on our farm. So a whole bunch of different uses. As you know, today, master gardeners, they use it for cypress mulch, which I'm not gonna talk more about that, but that's what they use it on. Y'all pretty much know all about that. So 1980, 1995, harvesting doubled in Florida. So a lot of our cypress trees got knocked down. They're long lived. They're related to the redwood. So long lived, over 600 years old. These cypress trees can be. So if you plant new cypress in, they're not going to grow pretty fast like pine trees and replace themselves. They use cypress to make these soft key spoons, which I'm going to talk about soft key, which is kind of like it's a soup. It's kind of like a crack corn type meal. But you can see this. Young lady right here in the glade. I believe she's either Seminole or Calusa, but you can see these soft key spoons, which they churn. And of course, those things live a long time. But they have some pretty cool things. They have this cypress tree right here. Um, Had to put this in there because it's called Jim's the Little Guy. And this is at Cherry Lake, by the way. This is available in nurseries. This is a dwarf cypress too, by the way, for you plant geeks. This is 15 feet, it's 15 feet in 20 years, so it's a slow grower. But it's a phenomenal, pretty cool plant. Okay. So yeah, Sofkey is actually derived from the Creek word, Sofkey or Osofkey. It's a sour corn drink used by native tribes who once lived primarily in the southeastern United States. For most North American tribes, corn soup is the common food, but it can vary greatly in its ingredients and preparation. The southeastern softy is different from the northeastern corn soup. Softy is made by cooking white cracked corn in large amounts of water. That also contains lye made of wood ash. The mixture is cooked over moderate heat for about 3 to 4 hours. And the soup is eaten hot and cold using a spoon or a cup, depending on the consistency, and which can vary from thin to like a watery porridge. So it tends to be sour, so it's considered to be an acquired taste. And it's served in most of any setting where food is shared, such as homes or various community gatherings. Okay, another one of my favorite plants is saw palmetto. Um, An underutilized landscape, by the way. I use this. You see the silver saw palmetto. We have it at our demo garden. I used to use it at the breakers in Palm Beach. Just a wonderful landscape plant, way underutilized. Wonderful growing plant, excellent for wildlife. The fruit is loved by black bear. The Seminoles use the fiber for baskets, brooms, fans. Still make them the Seminole dolls they use them for the fire dance ceremonies as well. Um, Alternative food source. Again, the fruit you can eat, the new stalks cooked or eaten raw. That's what the fruit looks like right there. This is a commercially exploited plant. You have to have a permit to harvest this plant um, if it's on somebody else's property. So it has been added to the state's list of commercially exploited plants. 2,000 tons of saw palmetto products approximately exported to Europe every year, 50 million. That price has probably increased over the number of years. So yeah, it's a big deal. Here you have it says an Immokalee man was arrested, accused of illegal harvesting saw palmetto berries worth more than $5,000. There's your permit through FDACS and so on. So people are still being arrested left and right for illegally harvesting this fruit. One of the coolest stories I had during the quarantine is that a gentleman was illegally harvesting this fruit, and he got arrested. Unbeknownst to him, it was the sheriff. It was the sheriff's property. So that's bad luck. So the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Sciences, FDACS, estimates bulk sales of saw palmetto berries to be around $7 to $8 a pound. So it's around in there. So you can see that top trailer with a whole bunch of bags of saw palmetto berries. The one on the upper left, you have the green, and the one on the right is the picture on the right is actually where you can get the permit for application. Buttonbush. Another wonderful landscape plant in the right plant, right place. This is considered a wetland plant, if you will, on the edge of shores. It's really not drought tolerant. It's really meant to be near a wetland area. It has these beautiful flowers, but they're really stamens, much like a button bush. And they're round and white. Butterflies, especially our eastern tiger swallowtails, really love this plant. So all parts are said to be medicinal. Okay, the inner bark was used for dental, to treat the liver, eye diseases. These were used by the Choctaw and Chickasaw. Again, I don't think there's anything to verify that through science, but the Seminoles use that through constipation, through the prostate. But this plant can be poisonous too. So you have to fix it the right way. So leaves used as a tea specifically for women with fevers. Modern day herbalists use it to stimulate the digestive system, treats nausea, but it does have these bitter glycosides. So it is a technically poisonous plant, especially for cattle. Okay. So you'll find that a lot of these plants that are used for food and stuff like that are poisonous. You have to prepare them the right way. Okay. So I'm going to tell you what I tell my people on my hikes. There is no eating of plants or anything out there you don't know or don't know how to prepare. You do not do that. There are several experts around the state that do that. If you happen to be in my area of Sumter, Kristen from Dade Battlefield, Kristen Wood, I believe she still teaches classes on edible plants, where she actually teaches you how to cook it the right way and you get to try them. Okay. So unless you know how to do it, you don't touch it. So it is a cool native plant. So here you have, um, let's see, I'm just trying to read the process here. So the bark was poured as an emetic to treat skin ailments when applied externally. Played a role in cultural practices. Its fibrous bark was sometimes processed for making cords or bindings. Um, Another method that extracted the active compounds or essential qualities of tough plant materials such as root, bark, stems, stuff like that by boiling down in water. This boiling down process helps break down the dense plant tissues to release beneficial constituents that are otherwise difficult to access. Um, so it's usually cut into small pieces and crushed, placed in a pot with cold water, typically a ratio of 1 part plant material to 10 parts of water. Then the mixture is brought to a boil and then simmered for an extended period, usually about 20 to 45 minutes. And after simmering, the liquid is strained to remove the plant material, leaving a concentrated herbal extract. All right, Calicarpa americana, American beautyberry. Another wonderful landscape plant. This is the one that was in our demo garden, but I've had them. I still have them in my yard right now. Well, they're they don't have anything on them now, but just sticks. But they're a wonderful plant. They'll start leafing out, start flowering in the spring, and start having berries around August. The white is called Alba or Lactea. It is not a very vigorous grower, but it looks pretty cool. But I love everything about this plant. Transplants very well, takes cuttings very well. Native Americans used the teas and for sweat bath rituals. The berries, roots, and leaves were steeped in tea to treat skin disorders, stomach disorders, colic, used to treat malarial fevers. It's said to repel mosquitoes, ants, and ticks. The chemicals are calicarpinol and intermedial. I think there's one more too, but those are the main ones. Um, and some of the tried these old school hikers, foresters, are firm believers in that. So what they do is they take the leaves, they crush the leaves, and they rub them on their skin and face, and that is a natural mosquito repellent. Back in the day when they had mules, horses, keep those mosquitoes off those animals, they used to do the same thing to them, crush them, you know, and cover themselves with that oil on this plant. A lot of people don't realize that's what these plants were used for. One thing I didn't put in here is it was used as a food. So it's jelly, beautyberry jelly. I don't know if y'all had beautyberry jelly. It's super good. Um, I would rank it just below muscadine jelly, but it is very, very, very good. Okay. So, yeah, crushed leaves were traditionally applied to the skin and placed under horse harnesses. So, modern studies have identified the active compounds. Yeah, it's calicarpinol, intermedial, and spatholunol, which have shown potential in deterring mosquitoes. Um, Jellies, jams, wines. It's been known where you can use the fruit for it. And of course, these vibrant berries attract deer, birds, and other wildlife. So it's just an excellent, hardy, tough plant with a cool history behind it. Now, wax myrtle is a neat plant that I like to talk about when I go hiking. One of the things I used to do as a master gardener coordinator is I used to have our master gardeners go out there and learn how to identify plants based on smell. You got to use your nose. And so you can identify plants based on the smell. Sanaquoit viburnum versus sweet viburnum, for example. Thryallis has its own unique smell. So our native plants, such as wax myrtle, because it has these oils in it, has a very unique smell. And of course, that oil in it is very flammable. This plant it's not going to go like flame up. It burns very, very quickly and has a lot of ash associated with it. And so whenever you light it up, those leaves burn quick. It turns like a grayish ash. And so this is what newlyweds use the ashes from the leaves. They place it on their tongue to strengthen their marriage. Okay. That was a thing that the pioneers did. This plant does have waxy berries in late fall or winter. 4 pounds of berries and 1 pound of wax to make these bayberry candles. Used for surgeon soap, shaving lather, sealing wax. It was said to to be planted away from the house to keep pests away. I don't know if that's exactly accurate or if that's actually true, but that's what it was used for. Probably not the smartest thing to do with the wooden cabins, considering this is a flammable plant. But here you have the little myrtle berries. This is actually the one that I planted years and years and years ago on my folks' property. It's still there, survives 2 to 3 month floods because that's actually a creek right there. And just a tough plant. And they do make a dwarf one, not the most wind tolerant plant in the world, but it is very, very good. So it's also known as Southern Bayberry. Again, used to treat digestive disorders. Um, so the candles, to create the candles, the berries were first boiled in water to release the wax, which floated to the surface. Once cooled, the wax was skimmed off, reheated, and poured into molds around a wick. And that resulted in candles that were very valued for their pleasant fragrance, their greenish tint, and slow burning qualities. Um, Additionally, the plant was sometimes employed as landscaping, natural fencing, um, and it's still widely used in the landscape today. And so you have our myrtle warbler out there. There's one that can digest it. It's great for birds, great for bird feeding, great for bird nesting. So it's a all-out wonderful plant. Now we have a lot of oaks in Florida, and oaks do hybridize. So some oaks, I can't tell you what it is because they do hybridize. But all of our oaks are excellent. Very depends on the situation. Right plant, right place. But live oak is a an awesome plant. Um, we have white oaks, we have red oaks. The red oaks, um, the acorns taste really, really bitter. Even they're probably more nutritional for the animal, but the white oaks are actually more palatable. Okay. It's a food source for Native American settlers. So they used to make the acorns in their softy. They used to roast them. They used to make, of course, use it for animal feed. Of course, you know that it was used as fuel, tools, lumber, timber. I don't know if you all seen the little galls on the oak trees, but they believe little people lived in them. So that was a legend. And of course, a lot of these plants, I don't go too much into dyes and everything like that, but a lot of these native plants were actually used as tannins and dyes for coloring clothing and different things. And of course, it was used as an astringent, which astringents any group of substances that causes the contraction or shrinkage of tissues that dry up. Okay, so it's used on the skin. Um, yeah, so it was used for building structures, constructions, especially for ships back in the day due to its strength and resistance to decay. The acorns, after extensive leaching to remove the tannins, were used as a food source, ground into flour, or roasted for consumption. Medicinally, live oak bark rich in tannins were utilized to create astringent infusions for treating wounds, inflammation, and digestive tissues. But it also has a cultural significance, resembling resilience and longevity, and its sprawling canopy provides shade and shelter. All right, so here you have an oak tree, and I don't know how old. This is one I used to climb on as a kid. I don't. This actually blew down, went down in Milton, but it was there for ever since I was born. And so I don't know exact age of this oak tree. They could live for hundreds and hundreds of years. But whenever you compare oak trees and tall sabal palms, um, if you have like a 40 to 50 foot sabal palm in the area versus maybe an oak tree, a little bit smaller than this, maybe, I would bet that that sabal palm is older by far. So they can live for hundreds and hundreds of years as well. And sable palm, we saw palmettos can live for. Our forester said there's one I think a couple thousand years old. It's a champion in the Withlacoochee State Forest. They can live for a very long time too, and so very long-lived plants. But the oak trees are outstanding. They're kind of to me they're not officially labeled this, but I think they're like a keystone species where you have a lot of species depend on this one organism for survival. Um, um, foxtail squirrels, gray squirrels, bats, raccoons, possums, gray fox, birds, and of course a variety of insects and arthropods, as well as snakes, reptiles, and amphibians. So, can you imagine a world devoid of oak trees? Okay, and also they're very wind tolerant, just tough, tough trees. All right. I always tell people if you can't grow a Yopon holly, you should probably give up gardening because I mean, you really can't kill this plant. Ilex vomitoria. Okay, so weeping Yopon holly. It's a native shrub of the southeastern United States. Indigenous people such as the Timucua Creek and Cherokee utilize the leaves to prepare a caffeinated beverage, often referred to as a black drink. So did the Seminoles as well. So this tea rich, so these leaves are very rich in caffeine and theobromine. So it was consumed during rituals and ceremonies for stimulating and purifying properties. The plant's scientific name, vomitoria, reflects its ceremonial use in inducing emesis, which is vomiting or nausea. Though this was more associated with ritualistic practices than the plant's inherent effects. Um, the branches were used as arrows. The bark was used for old people's sickness or nightmares. As you know, hollies are dioecious, males and females. Usually the weepings are mostly females that you see in the landscape. Of course, the dwarf are usually males. Doesn't matter if you have both in the, you don't have to have both in the yard. There's so many. This is an IFAS. This is by one of our photographers at IFAS, Tyler. He has a photographing this gentleman making this Yopon tea, but you can get it out. I think there's one called like Warriors Blend out there. Several brands of Yopon tea. It's not for me. I've tried it. It gives a kick for sure. But I encourage you to try it. It's kind of neat. It's one of these things that it's pretty cool, very, very popular a long time ago, went away. Now it's gaining in popularity again. So I'm glad it's coming back. But a wonderful landscape plant, wonderful bird plant as well. Cherokee bean, Erythrina herbacea. Very interesting plant to use. This is one. The one on the left is on my folks' property that I planted. There's a lot of variability with this plant. I've had plants that only get about 4 to 5 feet. You see plants that get about 15 feet. I have one that was a prostate, never got higher than a foot, more like a ground cover. Um, I find this plant very interesting. The seeds, you can see the seeds right here, um, were used as rat poison, contains alkaloids. So the seeds are very, 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 very toxic. Severe vomiting and diarrhea. This plant is deciduous. It loses its leaves in the wintertime. It flowers out and then it gets its leaves. Okay? And of course, you can see the flowers. They're red and tubular. So as you can guess, very important for um, sulfur butterflies, hummingbirds, and also the leaves are heliotropic, so they face the direction of the sun. Okay, so it's kind of a neat, very, very cool plant. Traditionally, the roots and seeds and bark were used as medicinal applications, though caution is advised due to its toxicity. Um, the seeds, which are bright red and hard, were sometimes ground into powders or used in preparations for treating various ailments and headaches, fevers, and mild sedative. The plant has also been used as a stimulant in some traditions. Um, but like I said, it has these toxic alkaloids, so it has to be used with great care. And I often wonder who was the guinea pig that they tried this on to make sure it works, right? How long did that take effect? But it for its ornamental value, it's a striking plant. It's one of these I would call right plant, right place, right situations. Because I have a 6-year-old and a dog, it's never going in my yard due to its toxicity with the seeds. But if it fits your yard and fits that situation, it's a neat plant. It does have little thorns on it, but horticulturally, it's just a very, very, very cool plant. You'd be amazed at how many poisonous native plants there are, by the way. This is Gelsemium. This is another very, very toxic plant. Um, you'll see this plant actually probably just it may be just coming out of bloom right now. So it's usually January, February-ish in my area. You'll see it really, really tall, creates these large thickets, almost like a monoculture in the woods. But Gelsemium is a very common plant. You get it in the nurseries. It is toxic. Does have these alkaloids. So it's a toxic flowering vine native to the southeastern United States. It uses folk medicine as a sedative, has calming properties. Um, the small amounts of flowers and leaves were prepared in infusions to treat conditions like anxiety or insomnia. The plant contains toxic alkaloids, it's called gelsemium, which can cause poisoning, including nausea, dizziness, and even death. Um, Despite its historical uses, Carolina jessamine is no longer recommended for medicinal uses due to its high toxicity. It's just primarily valued as an ornamental plant now. Um, it is flammable. Um, Rhizomes and roots were used for medicinal purposes. The staggering, uncoordinated movement with convulsive movements, comatose, and death. Um, it is said that bees get disoriented, so it affects them because bees are European honeybees now because they're not native. So they get disoriented. Doesn't affect our native bees. Um, but kids have been kids have died because of this too, because with another plant called coral honeysuckle, some y'all are familiar with, we used to you could pinch the end of that coral honeysuckle and suck out the nectar. You better not do it with this plant because it is toxic. I think this plant right here was in our demo garden, and we had an herb garden that my master gardeners built, and the flowers were dropping in the herb garden, and I was like, oh, that's not a good. So I actually had to chop it down because I didn't want anybody thinking that that was an edible flower. So you have to be aware of where you plant stuff. Okay, it's a very aggressive native. Okay, but when planted in the right place, I've used it on our property. Climb up a lattice, makes a nice barrier, and the birds like to nest in it. Okay. And it has this very sweet fragrance when you walk by it when it's flowering. Okay. Maypop. Now we have different passiflora out there. They call it maypop because the fruit pops. It used to be a game with the pioneer children back in the day. If you have one step on it, you'll find that out. The fruit and skin can be eaten raw or cooked, removing the seeds. Was used in pulp, in jams and syrups. Leaves can be used for teas and tonics, and it was used as a sedative. There's about 50 European sedation drugs that use these natural products from Passiflora, not just Maypop. But it contains cyanogenic glycosides, so repels most herbivores. A lot of your butterfly plants can be toxic in some form. So it is a wonderful, wonderful butterfly plant for like the Gulf fritillary and our state butterfly, zebra longwing. Um, but the plant's leaves, flowers, and fruit contain compounds that have mild sedative effects. It's been used in folk medicine to treat anxiety and insomnia, nervous disorders. Um, it's used to relieve pain, muscle spasms, gastrointestinal issues. The fruit is edible, sweet tart flavor. Occasionally used in jams or juices. I've never had it, but if y'all have, let me know how it tastes. But again, it should be used with caution. So to harvest the fruit, you wait until the fruit turns yellow or purple. It starts to soften. Gently pick the fruit from the vine. You wash it thoroughly under cool water to remove any dirt. Then use a knife to slice the fruit in half. The inside of the maypop fruit contains a jelly-like pulp filled with small seeds, and you scoop out the pulp, which can be eaten directly. The pulp said it has a sweet tart flavor. Here you have the picture right here. You have the upper left. You have the beautiful flower of the maypop, the passion vine, which is, to me, there's no plant out there like it. It's just wonderful. And of course, you have the fruit, which is growing. And once you go maypop, it's going to pop up all over the place now. But as you can see on the right-hand side, that little caterpillar, that's a Gulf fritillary caterpillar, feeding on it. So they'll take care of it. And with these two types of species of butterflies is interesting. If you have an area that's full sun, you're predominantly going to have Gulf fertile areas. If you have an area that's mainly full shade, you're probably going to have predominantly zebra longwings. And if it's a mix, you may have both. Okay. Muscadines, or some Floridians called scuppernongs. I grew up calling muscadines. This is the vines that we have on my folks' property that we had that my mom we used to pick the grapes off of it, and my mom used to make the jelly. Now you can make wine too if you have the what's it called Lake Ridge Winery that has a muscadine wine out there. This is another underutilized landscape plant too. But you make wine and jelly. You have black, purple, bronze, seedy grapes. Carlos, Noble, Blackberry are very good. Isons is self-fertile. The long stems were used by the Seminoles as deer snares, especially on the deer pass. So on the deer pass, they used to make deer snares, catch the deer. Okay. Um, their wild muscadines are male or female. Very rarely do I see grapes out in the wild. Um, but they lived a long time. We actually still have some of the grapes that my grandpa got. So those are approaching 50 years old, out on my sister's house who lives on our property. So we still have those going on out there. So they live a very long time. Um, so the interesting about muscadines is that they don't ripen all the same time on the bunch. You have to pick them individually, which is a pain. But they're very tough. Um, so yeah, wine, juice, preserves. The skin and seeds are rich in antioxidants, particularly one called resveratrol, which has been associated with various health benefits, including heart health and anti-inflammatory properties. Muscadines were used as again for snares and by Native Americans, early settlers. The vines are. I don't know if you've worked with muscadines, but they're very flexible, very strong, which make excellent snares. And of course, the vines can be twisted or braided into rope-like strands and fashioned um, uh, to make, different types of things to catch different prey, such as rabbits and stuff like that. Acer rubrum, one of our few maples here in Florida that can get colorful. But this is a wetland plant, so it's really prefers these lowland wood swamps. In the 1800s, it was introduced to settlers by Native Americans. So cooking ware, ox yokes, arrowheads. You can drink the sap was used to make a sweet drink. And of course, different acer species are used for liver and skin disorders. So medicinal uses, the sap of the red maple was collected in early spring. Similar to how maple syrup is made today, Native Americans would boil down the sap to make a syrup, and it's used directly as a sweetener. The sap was sometimes consumed for its energy boosting properties, and it was believed to have some medicinal benefits, especially for soothing sore throats or like a mild diuretic. The bark was traditional medicine. It was often boiled or made into tea to treat a variety of ailments, including coughs, colds, fevers. Some tribes use it as a remedy for dysentery or general tonic to promote health. In some cases, the leaves were used to treat different wounds, for bruises, for minor skin irritations. Um, the wood is very soft and lightweight, used to make crafting tools, baskets, canoes, used to make mats, ropes, and containers. And it was often the red maple trees are often associated with symbolism in Native American culture, representing strength and resilience due to their widespread growth and ability to thrive in diverse conditions. Some tribes consider the tree sacred and use parts of it as spiritual or ceremonial contexts. Okay. Asclepias, y'all know this. It's a great butterfly plant for our queens and monarchs. Okay, this was introduced to settlers by Native Americans again. And this is a medicinal plant. It was used to treat pleurisy, which is inflammation of the thin layer of the tissue that lines the lungs and chest wall. For bruises, sore muscles, southeastern tribes boiled it used it much like a vegetable. When used with Indian hemp, it was made into a strong cord. So it's a very vibrant perennial in North America. I've This is the only time I've ever seen this in the wild. This was for my Hernando County people. This is Lena Peterson Park. So we do hikes out there. Wonderful. It's one of my favorite places in Hernando to go. And this is one of the hiking trails. It was out there growing naturally. Okay. So it was used as a mild laxative to treat respiratory issues, fever, rashes, boils. But it's advised due to its toxicity when consumed in large quantities. So again, you got to be careful. We have this. I was trying to find my latest pictures and I couldn't find it to save my life, but we have these plants in our demo garden. I love this plant. The button snake root or rattlesnake master. Um, this is a neat plant. It's also known as Virginia snake root. Very highly regarded by Native Americans and early European pioneers for its medicinal properties. So the Cherokee, the Iroquois used the root is to treat snake bites, which is reflected in its common name. They would prepare it to apply the bites from venomous snakes, like a poultice type thing, believing it could neutralize the venom and ease the symptoms. In addition to its use for snake bites, snake root was also employed for a variety of other ailments, fevers, colds, respiratory issues, digestive disorders, mild laxative to help with ingestion. European pioneers used the plant to treat colds, fevers as a general tonic, and it was sold commercially for its supposedly healing effects with its digestive issues. But due to the plant's toxicity, it was often used with caution, especially when prepared improperly. Again, going back to don't do anything with a plant unless you absolutely know. But rope, strings, sandal baskets, expelling worms, vomiting, impotence, all sorts of different things they use it for. But I'm going to tell you, this plant is for horticulturally, it's going to go in my yard this year. I'm going to try to find it. But we have several in our garden. I've just come to love it when it blooms. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's a tough plant. Did very well in the cold. I'm just going to run through this one, not really quick, but marsh pennywort. This is what you find in the water on banks, used for respiratory ailments. Asiatica leaves and stems were used as a blood purifier, diuretic, leprosy, longevity, and so on. I'm not going to spend too much time on that plant. But sweet gum is another cool plant. A lot of people confuse it with Acer rubrum, red maple, but you can see how it has little five leaflets here. On the bottom, you have the gumball right here. So it's like a little seed head that's very spiky. If you ever walked on it with your bare feet, you'll find out really quick. I did that because we had this plant in our pasture next to the creek. Tree is still there. But the again, Acer rubrum leaves, not aromatic. Sweet gum leaves, aromatic, very aromatic. Okay. So it has what's called storax, which is sold commercially in pharmaceutical products such as antiseptics. Um, Civil War doctors use it as an astringent to treat diarrhea and dysentery. American Storax is still used today in making cigarettes, candy, soda, chewing gum. It's used today to treat coughs, skin infections, bronchitis. So Storax is from the sap. It was used in logging operations, temporary access roads and staging areas with challenging ground conditions. Sold for boiler chips for energy production. Gainesville, that was said to be used in Gainesville, is that boiler chip production. Um, Flooring, veneers, interior finish, sometimes to imitate mahogany. Native Americans use various parts of sweet gum for medicinal purposes. This, called storax or gum resin. Antiseptic, inflammatory, to treat wounds, bruises, coughs, colds. Inner bark was used to treat digestive issues. The bark, when dried and ground, was sometimes brewed into a tea um, to treat those issues. And of course, it was used to make utensils, tools, canoes. So it's used for a lot of different things. Still used for its popular day for woodworking due to its durability and very, very fine grain. Has a very interesting feeling bark too. whenever you touch it.
Hey, Jim,
Yep.
I'm going to jump in.
Sorry.
People have been filling up the chat box. I've been throwing in answers or the question
Thank you.
answers, but this one I can't. Lisa's asking what part of the sweet gum is used to extract the storax? Is that coming from the bark or the leaves
It's
or
a sap,
it's the
the bark.
sap? It's
Yep.
that sweet sap, that
hmm
liquid ambar. Okay,
Yep.
great. Thank
Yep.
you.
You're welcome. And it's liquid ambar styroside fluid. Wendy, this is actually the very first plant I learned in plant ID in Gainesville, so I'll never forget that scientific name.
Good one.
But it's in the, it has that smell. It's in the witch hazel family. So if you ever crush leaves and smell it, it's very, very neat. So again, that's a cool exercise for y'all to do is the smelling of the plants. Again, I'm just gonna brush by this one really quick, but this is not uncommon. We have this in Sumter next to some of the ponds. Um, but climbing hemp vine, it's in the sunflower family. It's just an Asteraceae. Seminoles use it as a dermatological aid, itching, blooms year round. You just have to look for it. It's not, like I said, it's not uncommon. You'll see it intertwining in front of the native vegetation. I usually see it, like I said, next to lakes and ponds. Again, uses it inflammatory for pain relief, fever, respiratory relief, and so on. Same as basically a lot of the plants out there. And we have betony, a weed out there, rattlesnake weed. I used to have this all the time in my bromeliads, my folks' property. Never really cared for it, but when I took Kristen Wood's class and when I attended it, and actually no, I didn't attend it. It was one of my master naturalists who made this for me. Was they let me eat the the tubers, if you will, and they're actually pretty good. But it is in the mint family, so it's a perennial herb. Has a pretty little flower, but yeah, so it has these tubers right here and these that look like little rattles off a rattlesnake, and they are pretty good. And I'm not a big plant eater type person, but they're pretty good. So it's used as medicinal properties, pain relief, muscle relaxation, and also to make tea. So topical application, digestive health, all that kind of cool stuff. Another plant out there is called bamboo vine or green briar vine, wild asparagus, whatever you want to call it. I grew up calling wild asparagus. There's different forms out there. There's so many variability on smilax. Some thorns, no, some no thorns. Was used as a dye medicinal plant. The roots were a thickening agent to make rootstocks and jellies. The Seminoles use it as a form of starch, used to make bread and fritters. Modern day uses include synthetic cortisone and steroid production. Um, so all these plants are found all over the world, parts of Asia, North America. Usually these heart-shaped-ish type leaves. Deer love them. This is actually in the Natural Area Teaching Lab in downtown Gainesville, where there's a pretty good population of deer, believe it or not. So whenever they do the prescribed burn, um, Smilax is going to be the first to come up, and it's very, very high in protein for the deer. The deer love it, so you can see where the deer are nipping it off right there. Um, Contains sarsaparilla, one of the famous uses of Smilax for it's a popular drink in the 19th century. The roots of Smilax were boiled to make a tonic, believed to make a cleansing or detoxifying or anti-inflammatory effect. Skin diseases, arthritis, and so on. We used to grow it along our barbed wire fence. Used to pick off the new growth. That's what I call wild asparagus. It's very good. But we used to grow it on a barbed wire fence to keep people out because you're not going through Smilax. So elderberry, food source for settlers and Native Americans. Don't confuse it with Queen Anne's lace. Okay, very poisonous plant. But even this, we have to fix it the right way because it does have cyanogenic glycosides. So again, the flowers were dipped and flour and deep fried and eaten raw. You make elderberry jelly. You make pies and syrups out of it. Of course, this is a very popular plant for dyes to make toys and other textiles. The berries of this plant were known for their immune boosting qualities to prevent and treat cold and flu. You still see that in stores today. Elderberry syrup is made from the berries, um, inflammatory and antioxidants for respiratory health, for skin health, and digestive health. There's so much on this plant, but cooking elderberries, you have to cook it the right way to neutralize the compound in order to make them edible. Pickerelweed, a wetland plant. What they used to do is you take the seed and young leaves, can be eaten raw. The seeds can be roasted and ground into flour, kind of like a granola type mix. Some U.S. tribes use it as a contraceptive, but they were used for all sorts of different things. The roots and rhizomes were edible, were traditionally consumed by Native American tribes. Very starchy, can be cooked and eaten like vegetables. Much like cattails, you can eat the roots of cattails, they're edible. Medicinal uses, um, used to treat wounds, sores, mild antiseptic, and for gastrointestinal properties. So many pines out there, but I'm going to talk about slash pine, found in low and flat woods. You get these turpentine resins, waterproofing chips. This was used in the naval stores industry. U.S. was the largest producer of turpentine, coming from Florida. Our longleaf pines had a hard time. They were almost wiped out. Used to treat irritants. Here you have this cat facing. I always wondered why I call it cat facing. I never could figure it out for the longest time. And of course, I figured, these little marks caused by these metal things that you hammer in, it looks like cat whiskers. That's why it's called cat facing. And it collects these turpentine into these clay pots. So you can still see the remnants of this if you look carefully in the woods. So this is one right here. This is actually Dade Battlefield, and you can see the old marks. Okay, see how the wound is, by the way. If you have a wound like that on a pine tree, that's probably cat facing at one time. But can you see the marks right there? Here you have a modern day version. This is at Chinsigat in Hernando. And you can see how they're collecting that turpentine in this clay pot, which is pretty neat to do. And believe it or not, you can make a lot of things through the pine needles. So one of the native plant clubs that I went into, I think it was native plant clubs, I went into the villages. They had these showing off were pine needles. I'm like, what? And this is pretty amazing. Don't ask me how they did it, but it's pretty amazing. Okay. Pokeberry. This is where they make poke salad. I know Wendy, there's one last one we talked about years ago when somebody corrected me because it poke salad or something like that. But it's all parts of this plant are poisonous. You have to fix it the right way. Very toxic to cattle and horses. Just going back to Gelsemium too, Carolina jessamine is very toxic to cattle. Um, but the young leaves were eaten as a vegetable. Um, used as a medicinal plant, used for chronic rheumatism, ringworm. You have to use the gloves when handling because can be an irritant. So this is another Native American plant, but the roots were used in small doses to treat conditions like swelling, rheumatism. The berries were used as dye for fabrics. Like I said, however, all parts of the plant are toxic, containing saponins and a protein toxin that can cause serious illness or death if ingested improperly. But yeah, this is where they make poke salad from. Close in on a couple more. Resurrection fern, polypody fern. I really like resurrection fern, because it looks dead. When it rains, it comes back out. But that's actually, they used to put this in like a bath to treat the people who they thought were kind of like mentally ill. They used to treat them and make them better. Used to treat for ill babies, and so on. But pretty neat history behind that whenever you tell people on the oak trees. Next up, we're going to cover mistletoe. I just want to make sure I end on time here. So mistletoe, as you know, is a very poisonous plant. Thief tree, phorodendron, that's what the genus means. But it's a parasitic plant, host plant, to a lepidopteran. Um, but like I said, all parts of this plant are toxic people have been killed, kids, especially kids, for eating this plant. So you can see the number of accidental cases of accidental poisoning in children or pets. So again, right plant, right place, right situation in your house. Okay. But It's a very powerful plant used in spiritual practices for the protection and healing due to its evergreen nature, symbolizing life during winter. Okay. But it contains toxic compounds such as viscotoxin, making it a potentially dangerous ingestion improperly, and modern use requires caution. Carolina willow. So you have this bark, this salicylic, that's used in the bark to relieve pain, for especially for fevers. So it's where it was used as a cooling medicine to ward off fevers. Today it was used. The roots were used to make a concoction that was used to increase a hunter's success. Is a host plant to the viceroy butterfly, which looks kind of like a monarch and queen. So this is like the precursor to aspirin back in the day. So this is what people used to take. Okay. Basket weaving, other crafts. It was used as a cultural, historical plant as well. Used to make the flexible and sturdy branches. The willow were used to craft traps, snares, even fishing nets due to their strength. But very, very cool plant. Couple more. So black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia, the Seminole is used to treat sunstroke with this plant. Headaches, used to make a tea for colds. The root juice was used for earaches and treat snake bites. Your common Rudbeckia. Who would have thought that your common Rudbeckia would have such a cool history? Okay. Your coon teas. One of my favorite plant. However, guess what? All parts are toxic. Okay, especially these seeds, which are carcinogenic. So this is when I took walking a sidewalk. They were all over the place with my daughter. My daughter asked if they're poisonous. I'm like, yep, don't touch them. And This is actually one of the biggest killer pets, by the way, in Florida. All cycads, sago palms, all cycad seeds, big killer pets. Okay, because they like to chew, especially the puppies. So the seeds are very toxic. It was used as a flower base with softy. So it's actually from Kunti. So it was they pulverize this underground stems, these caudices, then they wash away with water-soluble toxin, psychocin, to produce a flour for bread. Later, the Seminole Indians learned this process from from Native Americans before them, and around 1825 passed the practice to early settlers. So by the late 1880s, several mills were in business around Miami. By 1911, the starch had become known as Florida arrowroot. The Florida mills processed coon tea for military use in World War I. All of that harvesting and processing took its toll. Once commonly found in the wild, coon tea is now listed as a commercially exploited plant. This prohibits its collection from the wild without a permit. It is a perennial plant, great plant, full sun, part shade. The plant starch rich tubers were a significant food source, but you have to prepare them correctly to remove the toxins. After processing properly, the tubers can be ground into flour for baking or used as staple for various recipes. So it's used in culinary uses. Coon tea was used in folk medicine and so on. So again, it's a nice flour-based starch type plant for Native Americans. Of course, host to the Attila butterfly, which there's actually a population at Bok Tower out there if you want to photograph them. But that's the caterpillars and so on. They actually feed on the plant and pupate on the plant, which is kind of neat. All right, last plant. Save the best for last. This is one of my favorite plants out there, Tillandsia Spanish moss. Not Spanish, not a moss. It's an epiphyte, air plant. It's in the Bromeliaceae family. It's bromelia, just like a pineapple. It is not a parasitic plant. Okay. Now, if you have a dead tree that's already dying, it could exacerbate that. Spanish moss weighs a lot when it gets wet, so on a dead limb, it could cause some problems, but it is not a parasitic plant. I always tell people if it killed plants, every tree in the Southeast would be dead. This is the trademark of the South, is the Spanish moss. It was used to rub on the newborn babies of Native Americans to stimulate curly hair. There's an old story. There's so many variations. Gores, a Spaniard, that was in Florida. This is a legend. Okay, supposedly. And so he married a Native American princess. The Native American princess didn't like him. She ran away. So he chased after her. She climbed up an oak tree. So he climbed up after her. So she jumped out of the oak tree, apparently into a river or a lake, whatever. And so she jumped out. She escaped. He had this very, very long gray beard, hence the name Graybeard. And his long gray beard got stuck in the oak tree and he died. And so as people came, they couldn't find him because his gray beard had blended in with the Spanish moss. So this is one of the versions of that legend, which is pretty funny. So, but it was used for mattress to stuff mattresses and automobile cushions back in the day. Um, so people used to rake the Spanish moss off the tree. That's in fact what my grandparents did in Tampa and Ybor to make extra money. And it was 1 penny per pound. If Ford had to clean the moss, it was 2 pennies per pound if the people cleaned it before they got to the gin. So this is one of the gins in Tampa, old Tampa, where they used to take it to be processed. Okay. Um, it absorbs a lot of toxins, a lot of materials. So hence all these plants that I talked about for absorbing toxins. This is what they used to put the Spanish moss to absorb it. In fact, one of the largest lawsuits in Florida back in the day involved a chemical plant and a cattleman. If you ever had cattle, cattle like to eat Spanish moss. It's nothing to them, no nutritional. They just like to chew it, get cud, whatever. But the cows, the Spanish moss was collecting this toxin from this chemical plant, and the cows were losing their teeth. And so it was one of the biggest lawsuits in Florida at the time. You can look it up. Um, but it is a very, very neat plant. Now, some people say it has chiggers or red bugs. Not if you pick it from the tree. Okay. If you pick it from the ground, definitely. So don't pick Spanish moss off the ground. If you have chiggers, red bugs, it's a royal pain. They're a nuisance. What they actually do is they're small mites and they're blood sucking. They want a blood meal, so they're gonna climb up you. They're very small, so they look for these constricted areas like the back of your knee, your waist, your socks, and they take a blood meal, and their saliva actually eats your skin. So it causes this allergic reaction to you. But if you go home, take a shower immediately, it's going to greatly relieve that. But you're not bringing them home; they're going to drop off. Long time ago, we were told to put clear nail polish to smother them. That's not true. So a lot of urban legends with this plant, a lot of cool stuff. Great nesting plant for swallowtail kites, red-shouldered hawks, all of our nesting birds. I see people using to make saddle blankets out of to decorate their fence line. Makes a nice mulch. This is a cool hanging basket. Been wanting to do this, just haven't done it yet. This is in San Francisco, and um, and they had Spanish moss in the conservatory there, and it was you. I just think that's the coolest look in the world because you don't have to do anything to it. It's an air plant. Now, back in the day, what we used to do it for, I don't know who taught us how to do this. Um, Probably my grandparents at one time, but as kids, we used to roll this Spanish moss up really, really tight in a bundle. You also We have a creek that runs through our property when it floods. So we used to take that Spanish moss and put it on the edge of that creek to catch tadpoles and minnows. So you leave it there, and it was like a natural net. So pretty neat to do. So think of that next time you see Spanish moss. It's not just a great plant that we have out there. It has such a unique history to it. But it's also used in medicinal plant as a sedative and all sorts of different things for baskets, woven items. You still buy it today. You can go to Home Depot, you can go to Walmart. It's still in where their orchids and their hobbies areas. So it's so funny. Now, some people say to put Spanish moss in the microwave to kill the bugs. Don't do that. Okay. As an entomologist, I kill my bugs in the freezer. So just put the Spanish moss in the freezer. Okay. If you want to use it for decoration, and it's going to kill all the bugs. Don't put it in your microwave. All right. So I want to thank a lot of these pictures were from the University of South Florida, Atlas of Florida Plants. They gave me permission to use these pictures in an educational form. And so it's an excellent place to look for plants and ID. Excellent resource. Okay. So definitely have to recognize them. Different resources. I don't know if this plant is commonly available as an EDIS plant, but you can probably EDIS publication, but you may be able to find it. These 50 common native plants and this Florida Ethnobotany book, which is about this thick and weighs a ton. I think it's very expensive, but it's a neat book out there. So before we get to questions, if you're interested, if you're in the area, I do have a wildlife and invasive species conference coming up on March 26th and 27th. I try to make it as cheap as possible. $70 both days. I feed you a good barbecue both days with cake and snack and coffee. I There's a raffle each day, 10 bluebird nest boxes a day that I'm going to give out as a raffle. But we have different specialists and speakers. So I have Parks Page from FWC talking about the Florida black bear. I have Hans Ellington talk about coyotes. I'm going to be talking about alligators. We'll be talking about snook, invasive plants, prescribed fires, and a whole bunch of other stuff out there. So you can click on the QR code, click on the Eventbrite, or just email me, and I can send you that Eventbrite page and check it out if you're interested. We'd love to have you at that conference. So with that, I'm going to stop. Well, I'll just leave it there for a couple seconds. But are there any questions that anybody has that
There
hopefully I can
are.
answer?
I've been working the question box
Thank
and
you
I've
for
been
doing that.
because there's been a lot of questions.
Mhm.
I'm going to feed you some right now. The name of the woman who teaches preparing and using native
Kristen Wood, I believe she still teaches those classes at Dave Battlefield in
Dave
Bushnell.
Battlefield,
Yeah,
Kristen Wood. Okay,
Kristen Wood.
Candace. Basem is still wanting to talk about Spanish moss killing trees, and if you'll talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that, Jim.
So Spanish moss, like I said, it's not a parasite. A lot of people, we have a lot of people say that sucks out I've literally had people say this, that it sucks out the juices of the plant. It doesn't invade the cambium. It doesn't go in the xylem or the phloem of the tree. So it's not a parasitic like mistletoe. Okay. But if that tree is already sick, like a crepe myrtle oak tree, if that tree is already dying and losing leaves, that Spanish moss will take advantage of that empty space. So you'll obviously lose photosynthesis for the amount of leaves on that plant. So that can, like I said, exacerbate that tree, but it does not directly kill a tree.
Okay, Jim. And in a related question, Pauline is asking if Spanish moss is on the ground, will it stop weeds from growing underneath? Kind of maybe thinking about using it as a mulch almost.
Yeah, I use it. I don't use it as a primary mulch to do that. I use that as kind of like a filler. So, for example, it's the same as oak leaves. So, either Spanish moss, I'll put on as a base, and then I'll put my decorative mulch on top of that. So it saves me money. Does that make sense on that?
Yeah, that's cool.
But yeah, so it turns black, has very fibrous, so it does a pretty good job. And if you're going to use it, you might as well use it for that, as opposed to
That's,
just tossing it in the dump.
yeah, yeah. Um, I sent you a picture, Jim, of a clump of Spanish moss for sale for $20, so you can use it in the future.
That's awesome.
And another
Man,
thing about
we
Spanish
can
moss,
be rich if we did
we're sitting on a mint.
that.
Sydney Park Brown used to make like a frame, a wire frame, and then cover it with Spanish moss
Yep.
and use that as her orchid house. So I thought that was a
Nice.
neat kind of a living shade cloth.
Hmm.
So kind of interesting.
Very nice.
Um, and I want to kind of dive back into some of the questions. Someone shared with me a beautiful, Lauren shared a beautiful pine needle basket that she made. So master gardeners are doing that. And Yvonne Florian from Indian River, she said, last summer I found some green slash pine cones and made a batch of Muggalo. Good.
What is Muggalo?
That's what I asked her too. It's good for a cough. So we'll find out, I
Interesting.
hope. Let's see. Another question that was asked was, does the procedure for tapping a pine tree for turpentine kill the tree?
No, it doesn't.
No.
No, no. You have, and like I said, you still have these trees that are 50, 60-ish years old. They're dying off now because they're getting old. You can still see those trees out there, you know. In fact, if you go down to Chinsigat, you'll see the one they're currently doing. But if you walk down the trail and you see that little indentation on the tree, if you don't know what you're looking for, you just think probably it's like lightning strike or something like that. And that's old, that's an old cat face on that tree.
Yeah. Then Marie asked about the elderberries becoming poisonous if they're not cooked properly.
Correctly. So yeah, and I don't like to talk about cooking, like directly cooking plants to people in preparation. You're just gonna have to do your research and find the correct person to prepare that.
Right, wanting to be as careful as possible on that.
Exactly. Yep.
Um, and someone's talking about Bethany tasting like water chestnut. I
Yeah,
agree.
it kind of does. Yep, you're right. Yep.
Uh, and wanting to buy beauty berry. Where have you found that?
You know, any native plant nursery, Green Isles in Central Florida is pretty good, but y'all have a lot of them good ones in Gainesville, I would imagine. They're not hard to find.
Yeah.
And once you get one, like I said, I used to do propagation as a hobby. And you'd go 2 to 3 nodes down, and I had probably 90% success on all my beautyberry cuttings.
Oh, really? I haven't
Yeah,
tried that yet.
incredibly easy to take cuttings.
What time of year were you making
Spring
cut spring?
coming up,
Okay.
March, April. Yep.
Good to know. Mary Jo had her wax myrtle defoliated by squirrels each year. Can you explain?
Wow, that's a new one for me.
I answered her. I said sometimes squirrels are looking for moisture from leaves or berries, but
Yeah,
oftentimes they just act like squirrels.
yeah. I mean, they're rodents, they're rats, but I never heard that before. That's a new one.
Yeah, that's new. Somebody wanted me to let you know that they were joining in from Italy.
Oh, nice.
I can't believe they made time for us. So that was nice. And then do you know Ficus aurea, the strangler fig?
Yep. Hmm.
They're wondering if that berry is edible and are all figs edible?
That's a good question. I don't know offhand. We'd have to do the research on that.
Yep, sounds good.
Mhm.
How long would you put Spanish moss in the freezer for?
Oh, you just like for a couple of hours was fine because you're
Mhm.
only killing the small arthropods, insects and arthropods. That'll be more than sufficient.
I'm lazy. I just stick it in overnight, something like that.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, someone was looking for a beautyberry recipe. I gave them one from the Montgomery, Alabama Master Gardeners, but there's also a beautyberry jelly in Dick Jorling's Florida's Incredible
Hmm.
Wild Edibles booklet. So,
Yeah. And don't forget your native plant clubs either, societies, because a lot of those individuals, that's where I usually get my free jelly from.
yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
right. Let's see. And mostly, Jim, everybody's just saying how much they really appreciate and love the presentation
Great.
and someone is asking for a copy of it. We
Hmm.
can post the PDF if you don't mind
Absolutely. I'll send
with
that
the
to you and
recording.
then you can post it up and everything. And
Yes.
I'll actually send the version with the notes because there's so much I did not cover.
Right. You
Mhm.
did cover a lot.
Mhm.
Remember to take the evaluation, everybody. And I do want to mention that as you guys are out there sharing this information, because I know you will, because it's such good stuff. Notice how careful Jim was to he's not going to make medical claims. When he's talking about this, he's talking about how the indigenous people used it, how the settlers used it. We're not making any claims for medicinal properties of these things. And then when asked about specific preparation, he's saying, you're going to need to do your own research. And Jim, will you want to talk about how you kind of worded things?
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I go back to my hikers. We'll talk about blueberries, the native blueberries and stuff like that. You have to make sure because there's a lot of plants out there that look like other plants. You have to fix them correctly. But a lot of people want to eat plants in the field, and that drives me nuts because you have to prepare them correctly. And I'll be saying, okay, you do realize there might be a tick on there, right? And so do you really want to eat the tick? And they're looking at me like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, yes, because ticks are very small. And so they're on the edge of the path just like you are. And so, yeah, no food preparation, make sure you know exactly what you're eating. Okay. We don't want anybody to eat something they don't, that's going to be very, very bad or detrimental to you.
Right. Well, Jim, thank you so much. And we look forward to any other presentations. You guys go to his WISE seminar if you can. Every hour of education there is considered Master Gardener continuing education credit. So it's a really great way. And you're going to meet cool people. You're going to learn a lot of really great information.
Yep, and we're gonna have I forgot to mention we're gonna have Dr. Marty Main there too one day to talk about the Master Naturalist program and speak. So a lot of great speakers.
Fantastic, Jim.
Mhm.
All right. Take care. Thank you
Thanks,
so
thanks,
much.
Wendy. Thank you
For
guys.
sure.